Let's see. Nice.
Norway. That's awesome.
Wow. That's really awesome. Ooh. So, hi, everybody. My name is Sheila Ann Green. I am the CEO of Impactful. I'm also the film director of Race to Be Human. And I'm here with an incredible group of panelists. One also, I'll call out Jason Craig Harris, who's our social impact producer of Race to Be Human. And we are thankful that you are all here today. We really wanted to share some of the challenges and the inspiration that we have been coming up against and experiencing in taking this program out into schools and corporations and houses of worship. But I made Race to Be Human. It's the fourth installment in the Creative Coping Toolkit, which is a program that we've created to license to schools and corporations to get us talking about how all of these things affect our mental health. And Race to Be Human was, I'm Chinese and we don't talk about that in our culture, about mental health. And race and racism is definitely, at the forefront of so much of our conversations. I wanted to make a program that address the apprehension and fear that we have of entering the conversation. It seems that, we don't want to come off as tone deaf or insensitive. And if someone says, oh, you can't say Indian, you have to say Native American or First Nation or Indigenous people. And I kept thinking, like, who makes those rules? When is it okay to say something and not? And so I made this program to address just that, is that how can we have more positive, more comfortable conversation around race and racism and how it is affecting our communities? Is it helping? So I want to first show the trailer, which is about a minute. This is only about a 45-minute program, and it's free for everybody. And we really want to invite you to ask questions, and then we'll get started with the conversation. So Lisa, go ahead and play the trailer.
I never grew up talking about racism, but we all knew that it existed. I mean, the first instance that I had with racism was at 6 years old.
When I realized I was black and really realized what black really meant, I want to say I was 9.
I was 6.
I think 5.
First time understanding I was black, I don't even know if that's the right way to put it.
In kindergarten, I just realized that everyone was a lot lighter than me.
It's so traumatizing. The first experience that I had, I was little.
It wasn't like I ever thought I was white, but I never noticed that me being different was something that people would notice enough to say something about it.
Yeah, that's when I first realized that I wasn't white.
I think the first time I realized I was Korean, not white, it's funny because you would expect from birth, but I think was when in elementary school people would make those remarks and microaggressions and oh, that's what sets me apart. Not my strength, not my intelligence, not my input, but it's my race.
Thank you, Lisa. So we're going to get started here. I'd like to introduce Dr. Amber Gunner. Amber, do you want to share a little bit about what you do here and your why? Why do you do what you do?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And it's amazing that I still find myself getting teary-eyed even watching that trailer after have seen it, times and times again. So, but my name is Dr. Amber Gunner. I am the VP of Education Sales here at Impactful. And I've been in education for over 10 years now. In fact, my doctorate is in educational leadership. But that is not really what brought me here to Impactful. I had a cousin who was in high school and was struggling with anxiety. And it allowed me as an educator to really kind of be a bridge between her and her parents and helping them understand that, yes, teenagers can, in fact, have anxiety. Additionally, I remember seeing baby George Floyd, a picture of him with his mom, and automatically seeing my 4-year-old son. And so it was important for me to be intentional about the ways in which I wanted to impact or bring change. And when I got asked about working here at Impactful, it was a no-brainer. So that is why I'm here.
And June, head of engagement, share
Yes.
about your why.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is June. As Sheila was saying, I lead up engagement here at Impactful. So I work directly with any school or company that has any of our 4 film programs. So my why, I've been in the mental health advocacy space for a super long time. I think from my own personal mental health journey, supporting my family, being in both of those spaces, I've seen the personal impact and also from like a structural system, what needs to be changed. I think specifically what I have really been drawn to, it works great working at Impactful now, is we now have a lot of the jargon of talking about mental health, naming it, being, a little bit better and less stigmatized, but being able to really ensure we can create safe spaces for everyone everywhere to have these conversations about mental health, about race and racism. That's what I'm really passionate about. And so it works really great with the work I'm doing at Impactful. So I feel really grateful about that and being here today.
Thank you, Jen. And Jason, my social impact producer on Race to Be Human and speaker in the world. Can you share what you do and your why?
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be here with you all and to be engaged in conversation. I'm Jason Craig Harris, and I spend a lot of time working at the intersection of individual well-being and organizational health, realizing that we lead our lives not only as individuals, but individuals who are connected to a web of deep relationships. And so for me, conversation is the engine of transformation. So I spend lots of time around the world leading and facilitating conversations where folks can connect across lines of difference, which is actually not something we do quite well as a human species. So the very thing that we need, which is relationship, is oftentimes the very thing that harms us is also relationship. So really trying to figure out the mechanics and dynamics of well-being so that we're supporting increasingly young people and adults as well, because we're still learners too, but all of us to learn the skills that are necessary to have better conversations that allow us to see each other's humanity. So I have gone off and gotten trained in all kinds of frameworks and philosophies and systems, all centered on that thing, the dynamics and mechanics of human interaction and relationship. And that's precisely why I'm engaged in this project, because what we know is that racism, alongside other kinds of categories, are at the forefront, unfortunately, of what so often divides us. And so I'm interested in how do we bridge the gap, right? How do we bridge rather than oftentimes always emphasizing bonding? Bonding simply means the process of connecting to people who are just like us. Bridging is something deeper. It's about connecting to those who are unlike us, but who nevertheless might have something we need in a package that we don't expect.
One of the things I learned first when I met you was that we talked a lot about before even filming anything, was how do we model the new paradigm? How do we model what the world could look like if we weren't always caught in the struggle? And then, of course, as you just so beautifully pointed out, is the bridging. And I think that is really where our focus is. And through the voices of youth, because let's face it, we're all just kids in grown-up bodies. And when kids speak, they're so pure and unfiltered. And what I love is that when making this film, even through all that they've experienced, they are still incredibly hopeful. They've not given up. So Amber, I'd love to ask you a question. Your job is to help bring this programming into schools. And can you share a little bit about some of the challenges that you've bumped up against and how, yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the main things that sticks out is that, leaders of these schools are wanting to see something that is going to be inclusive and student-centered. And that is so important because we can get in the habit of talking at students or teaching at students. But the way in which our program is designed, it's with the students at the center and at the front. I spoke with a student leader who has also been conducting surveys on their campus to really kind of understand what the needs are. And when they say that they want to feel like they belong, what does that look like? And so it's really important that, on both sides of the programming, that we have something that's student-centered, and also that the leaders that are making decisions are valuing the students' input, especially those students that are more marginalized in what they feel they could use in order to belong. We've also been talking a lot about teachers feeling the need to have to be the experts in the topic. And we often have this saying about teachers more so really being able to facilitate that. And that's part of what we do, and part of when I bring June in as well, to be able to work with us in helping the campuses figure out a plan of how we can support them from a space that's student-centered, but also not expecting the teacher to be the expert.
And thank you, Amber. It's like a story every day talking to people, and it's so exciting, and sometimes just like heartbreaking. June, what are some of the things that you're coming up against, the challenges and the inspiration that you're seeing working with the schools and the corporations to implement the program, to onboard people, to get attention, to get people participating?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. And kind of as you already alluded, that is sort of my day-to-day, is talking to people, what's working, what's not, how can we maximize engagement for this incredible resource. So there was this one district office that was out on the East Coast. They had all 4 of our film programs, and they were just having a hard time getting Race to Be Human specifically up and going. They were really excited at first. They were using what I like to call, I think we all like to call, the big bonfire approach when rolling out our programs. So using, a community screening, or, an expert panelist, a community discussion about the film. They were really great about promoting on their district-wide communications. So we took a step back, and I was like, let's try this other approach that sometimes we'll recommend, which is little fires everywhere. So as it says, pick one teacher, pick one community organization to use the program, and really, that's really interested and you think can run with it, and let that be the thing that stokes the fire among your community. And so that's exactly what we did. There was a 3rd grade teacher in that district. She was really excited about the resource, was already leading BIPOC affinity groups. It was really incredible, one at the 3rd through 5th grade level and another at the high school level. And she was so excited to be able to have this to help support her facilitate these discussions. Sheila and Amber, this, but a lot of my job is, reaching out to people that have our programming, like, tell me what's working, tell me what's not, I just would love to hear and share. But this teacher was so excited about using this. I was getting the updates, which is awesome to have that. And in fact, she's trying to use Race to Be Human to create a multi-year program. So that's obviously incredible to hear, being able to shift that strategy. I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't mention the other things I hear from educators in schools, when there is talk of having discussions about race and racism, there are concerns that are brought to them. If we're talking about this among our students, among our faculty, is this going to bring up critical race theory, because we're talking about race and racism? And, Jason, we have you, our film expert. I think it would be really helpful and beneficial for our audience if you could define critical race theory. I know I hear about it a lot in the media. It's talked about, it's used, and yet I feel like there's still a lot of confusion about what it means. So I think it would just be awesome to hear from you.
Thanks so much for that question, June. And when I think of critical race theory, I think of a couple different things. One, I think of that, we have an amazing college and university system where the whole purpose, right, of being a college teacher and a researcher is to come up with different kinds of explanations about why things are the way they are. And in the college classroom, you debate, right? You have different kinds of theories about cause and effect, about why is it that this thing exists the way it does? Why is it that we have this particular data set? What caused this particular data set to be real? And what I think of is that critical race theory is an explanation, right, that attempts to, at least when it began in the 1980s in the legal academy and law schools, attempted to explain why there were systems of racism that seemed to be intractable. Why is it that we're not seeing enough change around, the disparities between people of color and white folks in our country? And there were some legal scholars who set out to explain that. Now, I want to be clear, they came up with different kinds of reasons, right? They also don't all agree with each other. So it's not the case that all people who espouse critical race theory all agree with each other in the very same way that the founders debated the Constitution. I mean, there's lively debates, right, in Philadelphia when the Constitution was first being crafted, even the Declaration of Independence. So critical race theory really is a scholarly endeavor that emerges in the 1980s in law schools with an attempt to explain the nature of racism and how it worked within the institutions in the United States. To be clear, that's a whole field. That's a whole philosophical scholarly endeavor, right? It's not the sort of lingua franca or the curricula of most K through 12 schools, right? That's actually not what this particular film is about. This film is about everyday experiences with individual people who are trying to grapple with their own racial identity and their own conversation with the wider culture that has stories about different groups of people. That's what this film is about. This film does not delve into all of the history and the debates and the laws and the politics. This is really about what's happening at the individual level and how do we try to have better conversations about things that impact all of us, and how do we kind of create the world that ought to be. I think about the idea that in the United States, we've just celebrated this national holiday called Martin Luther King Jr. Day, right? This beautiful holiday that pays homage to the beloved community, which was a framework that King offered us, this idea of a world that was no longer divided, but was intimately interconnected, right? With people who were living into those connections. He was steeped into a philosophy called personalism, which was this notion that the individual person has an incredible dignity that we can hold and honor. The whole point of this film is creating pathways to help people have conversations that are about uplifting each person's dignity. To me, that's a different kind of conversation than the more philosophical, historical, sociological conversation that is critical race theory.
And Jason, thank you so much for that. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the corporate world and businesses and organizations with regard to, pushing this conversation forward and making real change?
Absolutely. I appreciate that question as well. And I spent a lot of time in organizations around the world in various fields, and I see some perennial challenges. One challenge that I see is folks really struggle to have face-to-face conversations. It's really hard. And part of the reason why is I think folks are understandably afraid that if they say the wrong thing, if they use the wrong word, they're going to be shamed and eventually they're going to be canceled, right? That somehow what they say or what they believe will render them, a kind of implausible member of the community. And so people are quite afraid. And so as a result, folks don't say anything. I often find in my conversations that folks are torn between underreacting or overreacting, right? It's either I won't say anything at all, or I'm going to talk so much and not make any space for anyone else. What I am seeing is renewed attention in various kinds of organizations around the world, and certainly in the United States, a renewed attention to, can we create spaces and guidelines to have productive conversations about things that we may not always agree with? Is it possible for us to have spaces where we can talk about how different members in our community experience our environment? Can we begin to have conversations about inclusion and exclusion and what it feels like to be included versus what it feels like to be excluded? I'm seeing a greater awareness and a desire to have that conversation. But what I'm also seeing is folks want to have the conversation, but there's not tons of guidance out there or practices or examples or models about how to do so well, especially in the workplace, right? People expect that, okay, in a school environment, we can see having some courageous conversations, but you want me to talk about this stuff at work, right? But the research tells us that we spend so much time at work, and work actually has a profound impact on our mental health and well-being. The US Surgeon General just released a report and a framework in the United States for how to think about well-being at work. And guess what? Dignity is core to that framework. You can't have dignity if you can't talk about the things that get in the way of honoring people's dignity. So I'm seeing more and more workplaces trying to take risks and to collaborate to be able to have those conversations. And in my experience, when the program is well run, well crafted, when we have guidelines to have the conversation, almost always people say, gosh, that's so much easier than I thought it was going to be. I was so afraid. I was so worried. I was so anxious, but you gave us some tools to have the conversation. And what do you know? It went well.
Wow. Okay, that's, it's so incredible. And it does kind of come down to character education, right? Like, how do we be our best selves in every scenario and with people of all different ethnicities, and honoring like their history, their family, where they come from, what they believe. Amber, I wanted to ask you, how do you, being a former educator yourself, what do you think educators need most to support them to have these conversations in the classroom, and especially like educators, students, staff of color, because they're a minority?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think to echo what Jason has already shared, the hardest part about this, and even when I look at all of our 4 films that we offer, they really require us to bring back our humanness, to have love and to have compassion at the forefront. And again, as educators, when we are defined in a field, I'm a former math and science teacher, it can be very crystal clear if a problem is correct or incorrect. And when you get into having these conversations, it's like, how do I still, be the educator, be the person at the front of the classroom, determining how these conversations go. And one of the things that I've talked with a lot of educators about and a lot of school leaders is understanding that this is not something that is intended to be perfect. It is something that is intended to start conversation so that we can begin centering the voices of the community members, of the educators, of the teachers, of the students, of those marginalized groups. And I think that's important, that we ask questions and also that we're ready to listen to what they have to say, even if it can be uncomfortable for us, because that is data, that is information for us to then be able to create those student groups that report to the principal. Then we take that data and we create initiatives so that we can actually take action and steps forward. And I'm not only proud to work here at Impactful, but I also agree that it's hard to try to find a product or a platform that's really going to guide it and celebrate it, but also require us to really dig deep and have some uncomfortable conversations, knowing that it's leading us to where we want to go.
And, the more we have these unfamiliar, uncomfortable conversations, the more comfortable they become, and then they're not as big of an issue. June, I know that we were talking before, in preparation for this conversation, and you had said something that was really powerful to me, which was that, teachers are not expected to be experts in facilitating this program and having these conversations. Do you want to add a little more to that?
Yeah, thank you. I think just like you're saying, not only teachers, but, student leaders have this, company leaders, CEOs, head of wellness, benefits, community organizations. They'll come when we're, talking about rolling out this program, there's a lot of excitement. And then there's almost like but wait, I'm not an expert in mental health or race and racism. Am I really equipped to be a facilitator of this conversation, to, make sure that this is a, productive conversation? And my answer is, typically, yes, that is completely okay. If not, even preferable. I say that because there is something really powerful when, a leader is up there having this conversation, facilitating a conversation, and is able to model vulnerability and saying, I don't know all the answers, and yet I want to be going through this process of learning with you. It's incredible to model for anyone that's in that conversation, as well as just a great reminder for all of us. The moment that we think we're experts is, in fact, when we don't know. And I think especially in topics like race and racism and mental health, it's really important to constantly express that humility, and that was something working with schools and teachers when we are rolling out this programming, and I tell a group of teachers, you don't have to be experts, the relief that you see on their face, like, oh my gosh, now I can relax. I think it was Jason that was saying, in the corporate world, you're nervous about saying the wrong thing. And so to be able to be given permission, it's okay not to know, as long as you're open about that and model that, is in fact going to create a really safe space to have these conversations for everyone. And that includes in the classroom, in a professional development. We've had teachers and schools use Race to Be Human to guide professional development conversations. As a parent, having these conversations at home, in community. And so I think really thinking about that facilitator rather than expert, you can use it in so many different settings.
It's very, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to that because, June and I were able to conduct a training with the school, and it was so powerful for the teachers to be able to go through the dashboard with us, to be able to actually start lesson planning, but to also have their administrators there for them to share their genuine feedback and concerns about opening this up to the students. And so it creates a way not only for the leaders of the campus to be aware, but also to provide continued support to the teachers as they're rolling out this programming. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that again, because that was so powerful in that moment for them to have support and be able to discuss their concerns around it as well.
And the parents, sometimes the educators at the school, the students are all in, and then the parents are saying, wait a minute, I'm not ready for this. And then how do we, Jason, being a former educator as well, like how do schools tackle that? And then I also do want to get to some questions, because we've got some amazing questions here too.
My own belief is that when conversations about race and identity and other categories emerge, that should not be a conversation only for, the classroom. My view is it should be a whole school approach, which is that I don't want to be engaging in conversations with students, and I'm not also supporting parents and caregivers so they have the resources they need to extend the conversation at home. And so, I spent much of my career in working in schools, and I still do a fair amount of work in schools. And what I often say to administrators is, look, we need to have a partnership between the home and the school. We need to make sure that we are opening our doors and bringing in parents and caregivers to say, here's what we're talking to students about, and here's how our conversations are grounded in our core values. One of the things that happens when we don't partner with parents and caregivers is, given the sort of gossip and suspicion reel and factory that's out there, parents and caregivers are like, what are you talking to my kids about? They're coming home and asking all kinds of questions, and I'm not prepared to have the conversation at home. What we know is the learning does not stop when 3 o'clock or 3:30 rolls around and school is dismissed. So we want to make sure that parents and caregivers have a window into the curriculum, particularly around topics related to social and emotional learning, and that they are being resourced so that they can continue the conversations at home. So for example, I just went to a school, did a whole program on race and brave dialogue, and then I did a second session for all the parents and caregivers. Then I created a lesson plan so that parents and caregivers could continue the conversation at home with their kids. Again, all of that connected. What I think is really important is that parents and caregivers need to also have practice in having brave dialogues. And so in some ways, if you're a teacher, you're not just educating the kid, you're also in part, as a school, responsible for educating the parents in some small ways, but giving the resources can be so helpful.
Well, and we know from when we made this film, the core part of the program, and we had over 850 school counselors and educators from around the world watch various cuts through our journey of making this program and giving us feedback. And then we were finished, right? And it's 43 minutes. It fits within a classroom period. We got all the materials to surround conversation, reflection, activities, you name it. And then more, as the the program's rolling out, we're getting more feedback. Can you add something in there about white guilt? Can you talk about the model myth minority? Can you talk about what happens in communities? And we were thinking, we can't go back into the film. So we started creating learning bursts and more chapters with reflections and conversations to be shared at home and in the classroom. And it's just fascinating. It's just evolving, and we're learning. And I feel like we are making progress. And we're learning, like we're not experts either, but we made this program to share because just like with parents, I used to think, I had to have all the answers as a parent. So if my kid asked a question, I needed to have the right answer. And then at some point I realized it's okay to say, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. And modeling that vulnerability, it brings comfort, right? It brings a sense of solidarity that we're all going to be able to evolve together. Okay, we've got a couple questions in here. Jason, I know you can see the questions as well. There's one here from Keith Reynolds. How does long-term racism impact self-esteem, self-image, Black fatigue, and mental health once internalized?
Appreciating this question so much, Keith. And what I would say is that the research from the American Psychological Association suggests that being exposed to long-term mistreatment, invalidation, and marginalization, exclusion has a tremendous impact on one's self-esteem. And so, in fact, it can result in a flattened sense of confidence. It can result in depression. It can also result, theoretically, even in increased likelihood of morbidity, right? Imagine, for example, that you're not allergic, but you've been stung by a bee or two, right? You're going to be fine. You can be resilient and go about your day. But imagine that actually that bee sting turns into 5 and then 10 and then 15 and then 20. Even the best of us would check out and say, I'm going home. It's a wrap, friends, right? That right there, that metaphor is in some ways the equivalent of being subjected to various kinds of identity-based harms, where somehow folks, because of the stories they've told themselves about you and about who you are, those ungenerous stories, those stories they've told themselves has resulted in their treating you in ways that do not honor your dignity. And if that happens over and over and over again, it can really diminish your sense of self-confidence. And then ultimately what you're faced with is a choice. Will I internalize and believe these stories about myself, or will I, in collaboration with others, create a counter narrative, a counter story that honors my full humanity? The truth is, our culture is full of all kinds of stories that diminish the humanity of many different groups of people. And it's incumbent upon us and others to join together and to create new stories that celebrate the fullness of who we are.
Oh, wow. Okay, there's another one here from Stevie, I think. We're showing this film at our community theater, and we are receiving some pushback from our school system because they're not focusing on race and racism right now at a policy institutional level. How do we meaningfully engage them in this conversation without making them feel pressured or afraid of having this conversation within the classroom and the school board? Jason, I'm tossing that one to you.
I love this question, Stevie. Thank you so much for it. And, one of the things that I would say is, for me, this film is about mental health. It's about the health of individuals and the health of a community. The truth is, racism doesn't take a day off. It will continue to impact the students in our care. It will continue to impact the families in our care. And so if we're not having the conversation, the truth is the conversation is happening anyway. It's just happening without our guidance and our support. The wider culture is always socializing us into its value systems. And usually the value system of the dominant culture is about insider, outsider, is about who's inferior, who's superior. That's always happening. So the question for us as an educational entity or system is, don't we want to get out in front of that? Don't we want to be on the front lines of supporting folks to have the conversations in an environment that has guidelines and care and educators who can be engaged? That's how I would respond, number one, right? To folks who are a little bit trepidatious of engaging. Number two is I would say, yes, I hear your nervousness because you're thinking if we have these conversations at this level, it's going to cause us to take a deep look at all of our policies and practices. And I would say, that's a good thing. And number two, you don't have to do all of it at one time, but you can begin to take a look at your institutional practices and policies to see, are they promoting well-being? And you can do that in a scaled way, right? That's the idea of change management. Not all of our changes have to be made overnight. I don't know anyone who went from birth to adulthood in one day. Not going to happen. We're going to grow and stretch over time. And so if we normalize growth pains, if we normalize the process of change and transformation, it will be a little bit easier for folks to lean into the work.
And just to add to that too, Jason, I think, Stevie, that goes back to what I was mentioning before of this big bonfire versus little fires everywhere approach, like bringing in that, more organizational institution and saying, hey, this is just one first step, kind of like what Jason was saying. It's not the end all be all. It's not like this is now the expectation. It's just getting it started. If anything, that could be a really great, kind of temperature check of how is the community feeling about it? What was the reaction? And that's actually super informative then to go back and be like, how are we now going to inform, any other research or any other community initiative? So I think if there's any way to bring them in and show how it's a joint effort is, what I've seen a lot. If a school administration is wanting to employ something, maybe the educators are on board for, or vice versa. It's just about coming to the table and figuring out how really these are all everyone's goals.
Yeah, and that actually can feed right into, there's a question here that says, what does an affluent white community seek to gain from this film? And we all know racism affects all of us, right? I mean, even regardless of the color of your skin, your ethnicity. Jason, you want to take that one?
This is a great question. I think, my framing on this is, look, we're part of a large interconnected web. Dr. King would say, what affects one person affects all of us. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so a white affluent community, I would say, look, this community has, amazing people who are empathic and who care about changing the world. I don't know a single person, I mean, for the most part, who wouldn't say, yeah, I don't care about making the world a better place. Absolutely not. Right? I've heard people say that in their worst moments, but on their best days, most people say, yeah, I want to make the world a better place. This film is about that. This film is about how do we create an opportunity for greater conversation that is meant to create empathy, right? We may not be living in the experiences of those around us. We may have a great distance from particular groups of people, but if we were in their experiences, if we were experiencing exactly what they were experiencing, what would we want people to do for us and with us? For me, it's that conversation. It's about creating an opportunity for empathy and recognizing that we are all a part of this greater world. And so I should be concerned about issues that don't negatively directly impact me. Why? Because I would want someone to be concerned about me. I mean, the German Reverend Martin Niemöller, at the height of the Nazi regime in Germany, said it this way. He said, look, first they came for the socialists, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. But then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So my investment in empathy today is about my salvation tomorrow. If I care, if I try to do this work because I care about folks in the broader community and what's happening for them, it will all ultimately redound to my benefit. We have a mutual obligation to pursue a society of dignity and belonging for all, because a lack of dignity is contagious. It has a way of leaking out and negatively impacting folks far beyond what we immediately think.
Yeah, and I think one of the activities in the Race to Be Human Creative Coping Toolkit program is learning about your own family and your own family history and your own story, so that you can know where you come from. You say it in the film. It's hard to know where to go when you don't know where you come from, but it also helps to teach us to honor other people's stories and their background. We have a question from our LinkedIn stream, which is, and I'm going to get.
Yeah, I was going to add something just before we move on to the next question, because that initial question came up about self-esteem and self-confidence, and to tie it into the question about, why is this something we should care about as a white affluent community? What we also know in the terms of mental health is that all of this is very layered. Even the question coming in about bullying. So someone's self-confidence, their self-esteem, that not only affects that person of color, but we're seeing the ways in which it also impacts bullying and how we have conversations about, students being able to be upstanders. So the threads that we're seeing within race and racism not only happen to communities of colors, but those issues are also prevalent in other topics within mental health as well.
Dr. Amber, I have to jump on this point because this is such a powerful point that you raise. So one of the myths that we've told in our society around race has been, people of color, largely speaking, are inferior, right? And so we focus a lot on trying to think through, as to Keith's earlier point, what's the impact of that story? But the corollary story that we've also told is that white people are superior, right? That's a story that's out there in society. Most of us disagree with that story, but it nevertheless is out there in our society. Do you know the impact of that story on white children? On white young adults? What the research has suggested from the last 10 years of sociological research on white affluent communities is that young white people oftentimes experience a great degree of the labor and the burden of perfectionism, right? Where they feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect. Why? Again, connected to that broader story that we've told ourselves, which we have oftentimes thought only impacts negatively kids of color. But the corollary is horrible. If you have to always pretend to be superhuman, that's another way of being dehumanized. It's another way of not being in touch with your full humanity. So now we have all these white affluent children who are experiencing like the weight of perfectionism, which is part of that wider culture of the narrative of supremacy. And as a result, what do you do with all of that? That weight, you start to try to figure out ways of self-numbing. The honest truth, that the number of young white affluent children who are addicted to all kinds of drugs and so on and so forth, as a result of trying to wrestle with the burden of perfectionism because they're like, I can't be perfect. It's not possible for me, is astronomical. I have spent so much time in white affluent communities counseling young white people who are burdened in this way and who are not quite sure how to be fully connected to their humanity apart from the story that told them that they were supposed to be superior. So for me, this is actually about all of us. And I just have to say one last thing about this, which is that, in the United States, hate groups are on the rise. We have about 964 hate groups across the country. Where I live in New York, 47 of those hate groups have their headquarters in New York State. Surprisingly, 25 of which have their headquarters in New York City. Those hate groups, many of which are formed around a certain story about white people, right? There's a certain story about white supremacy and superiority. Many of those groups are actively recruiting young people, actively going to college campuses and to high schools, trying to recruit young white people into their perverse framework around belonging. I have a school community in California that was just peppered with flyers from hate groups trying to recruit young white people. So for me, racism is impacting all of us, maybe in different ways, but it nevertheless impacts all of us for all of these reasons. We need a narrative of belonging that is wide enough and capacious enough to include all of us so that we can reject perverse forms of belonging that are actually just based in hate.
And isn't there also like a PTSD effect beyond the sort of perfectionism, but there's that kind of bystander effect as well when you're watching and seeing this injustice and this, negative treatment towards people of color, and how do you manage and handle that as well? Or white guilt? Can you just address white guilt for a minute? We get a lot of parents who say, what do I do when my kid comes home and they're learning about racism in school, and then they say, oh, Mom, I feel so guilty that I'm white?
That's a great question. And I'll throw out just a quick frame around my own thinking about this. I played basketball for a long time. And I actually really enjoy the sport, so much so that I really identified with my high school team. I was a co-captain, it felt great. I was like, yes, I'm a part of this team. I love my boys. It's wonderful. But I'll tell you the truth. I over-identified with that team, or identified them with so much that they became a part of who I was. So for example, if someone came to me and said, Jason, a member of your team did something that was really hurtful, I would actually feel personally impacted by that. Immediately I would say, oh my gosh, what did they do? Because I would feel like it impacted our collective identity, right? So I would feel a sense of guilt, not because I did something directly, but because I was somehow associated with someone who perhaps did, who shared a core part of my identity. So in that way, it's actually quite normal for people to experience guilt by association. It's like if my older brother did something ridiculous, I would feel guilty. I'd be like, that's my family name. I would feel a certain kind of association with that. So I just want to normalize the experience of white guilt. It's actually just social guilt that's being experienced by a racial group. It's totally normal for a person to feel a little bit guilty when they hear that a member of their group did something that was harmful. So number one, it's normal. Number two, the goal is to move from guilt to empathy to responsibility. The guilt is there in part because you actually care. So if a kid comes home and says to me, I feel a little bit guilty, I'm like, that shows me that you care. That shows me that your empathic muscles, your moral imagination is actually working. Here's the next question though. Great. I see that you have some empathy here about this other group of people that you heard the story about. So let's talk about what can we do in our daily actions, even small things that we can do to make a real difference about this issue. The greatest antidote to guilt is responsibility, is taking action. Is there one small thing that we can engage in together as a family, repeatedly, consistently, insistently, to be able to assert dignity? Does that mean that we're going to educate ourselves on a group of people that we don't really know? What kinds of films are we going to, documentaries are we going to watch together as a family? Hint, hint, Race to be Human. But other things, right? What museums are we visiting? What stories are we reading so that we're educating ourselves about different groups of people? When we hear about something that happened where there's exclusion, do we talk to our kids about, okay, if you saw that happen on the playground, what do you say? What's your response? What script do you have ready to be able to respond in that moment? You can be an upstander. Again, responsibility over guilt. Guilt's not a bad place to begin. It's just that we can't stay there.
Oh my God. This is such a great conversation, and I know we're at time, and I have so many questions I wanted to ask, but we didn't get to them. We are recording this. We are going to share it with everybody. We're going to also go through the questions that didn't get answered, and we're going to answer them, and we're going to send those out as well. And you can also get as much information as we can offer you at impactful.co. And I do want to wrap this up with each of the panelists. Just share one thing you would love for the audience to take away from this. And June, I'll kick it to you first.
Oh man, hard act to follow. I think definitely just one thing to take away is, I think, really reiterating what Jason just said, like, start with one thing. Don't let changing the world and like that as your goal be a barrier to making small changes every day.
Amber?
Yeah, I would say to focus on community. So many of the elements that we talk about in all of our film programs are not isolated things that just happen at school between peers or between the teacher and the student. I have changed so much as a parent, even being able to take away some of the things that we talk about in our film program. So really being able to see it beyond the classroom, beyond just that peer-to-peer relationship, and allowing it to transform all the areas of your life.
Jason?
One of my favorite phrases is, we make mistakes, but we are not mistakes. And I think we have to normalize the fact that we are going to mess up in these kinds of conversations. We're going to say things that are harmful, but we can own it. And I think that what I would want to see for our young people, particularly our young white people, is to have enough sense of their own dignity that they can move into a space of accountability, right? And so often I have conversations with young white people where they say, look, I'm so afraid to have this conversation. I'm afraid about what it says about me. And my response is to say, look, you're an amazing, awesome person. And precisely for that reason, you can do this hard thing about taking an honest look at our country, the status we're in right now, our history. We can do hard things.
And I will just say, I shouldn't have been watching the news this morning, but I did. And I have so many feelings about the sort of precariousness of our world, especially our country. And I was nervous to have this conversation, even though I know all of you so well. And I feel like I do this every day, all day long. It ebbs and flows. Sometimes I feel really confident going into these conversations, and I feel like I can model and be vulnerable and lead. And sometimes I feel like I don't know what to say because I might say the wrong thing. And it's important to just keep pushing through it. There's nothing bad that's going to happen. And so long as you lead from a place of love and curiosity and not fear and judgment, you're not going to offend. You're going to navigate through it, and we're going to be better for it in the end. So, thank you, everybody. Thank you to our entire team. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. We are going to do our best to get all these questions answered and more information out to you. And we'll do more of this because clearly it was a good conversation. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so